Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the Clery Act and Primary Prevention. This is the last webinar in a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Associate Executive Director of Programs for the Clery Center, and I'm going to moderate today's webinar. I'm first going to start by reviewing some housekeeping items before we get started. We encourage you to interact with us by using the questions pane on your control panel. So we're going to have moments and opportunities throughout the webinar where we're going to ask you some questions. We're going to be looking for some of your feedback, and certainly there's also going to be an opportunity to ask questions of participants as we go through. So please engage with us as we go along. We are going to record today's webinar, and it is going to be posted on the No More page for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So if you've not had the opportunity to sign up to participate in this year's campaign, you can do so by clicking on the link that was just provided to you by my colleague Amy in the control panel. And as a reminder for those of you who may be new to the campaign or may be new to the program, this year we really reinvented our No More, Do More campaign. And the goal of the campaign is to connect institutions with information and resources at no cost to them. So those of you who've signed up for the campaign already, thank you so much. We know that you've been utilizing a lot of this information throughout the month and certainly will access it and can continue to access it throughout the year. And those resources are divided into No More resources, which are designed to increase knowledge in certain areas. These webinars are certainly a part of that. And then also Do More resources. So that's really looking at how do we turn this knowledge into action by putting in place policy evaluation, putting new programs in place. So we hope that you'll turn some of the knowledge that you take away from this particular webinar into action on your campus in terms of new programs or new ideas that you implement. So just to give you a sense of the flow of today's webinar before we move forward, we're going to start with our panelist discussion, but we will leave time at the end for questions and answers. You can also feel free to ask questions as we go along. We will address them as we can, or we'll certainly leave time at the conclusion to address those. Feel free to use the questions pane in order to do that, and it's always our goal to get to as many as possible during our time together. With that said, I am thrilled today's panelists were able to join us, and I'll share a little bit about each of them before we get started. As the manager of national programs for Men Can Stop Rape, Adrienne Valdivia is in charge of development, marketing, scheduling, facilitation, evaluation, and other aspects of Men Can Stop Rape training. Adrienne also contributes to the development of new and improved training modules and coordinates awareness to action workshops with local youth. Adrienne co-facilitates Men Can Stop Rape's biennial Healthy Masculinity Training Institutes. And we've had the pleasure of working with Adrienne before and Men Can Stop Rape before, so thank you so much for joining us, Adrienne.
Thank you for having me.
Tremaine Robertson is the Violence Prevention Health Educator at the Wellness Resource Center at Virginia Commonwealth University. He provides education, training, and advocacy services for victims of sexual assaults, intimate partner violence, and stalking. Tremaine also advises student peer education and dialogue groups, students advocating violence education and support, which the abbreviation is SAVES, and Men Against Violence. Tremaine is an alumnus of the University of Virginia and Syracuse University, where he is completing doctoral study. So for this webinar, we wanted to start by giving some background on the topic that we're focusing on today. So I'm going to give you a little bit background first, and then we'll go into our discussion. So as many of you know, there are specific prevention elements that are required under the Clery Act, and 2013 amendments to the Clery Act added prevention requirements for sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So as part of the Act, it's mandatory that institutions provide primary prevention and awareness programs on these particular topics for all incoming students and new employees. And then in addition to that, the campus must provide ongoing prevention and awareness campaigns for both students and employees. So this webinar is certainly not going to cover all prevention requirements for Clery. We certainly will have other learning opportunities throughout the year, and we have some on our YouTube page as well from past webinars that can help address that. But instead, this one is really intended to look specifically at primary prevention in order to get you critically thinking about some of your own prevention work on campus and hopefully give you some new ideas and strategies as to how you execute these programs on your campus. And we know that these programs are important because, one, we know that effective prevention programs can really empower individuals within the campus community to feel as though they can make a difference. And I think one of the other challenges that we often run into in doing this work is that people think that the decision to make a difference within the community has to be a big and drastic decision. So some of the goals in terms of these programming or the programs that you implement on campus is really looking at how do small decisions make an impact within the campus community, and what are some of those ideas. So the goal is that students and employees can have really practical tools for how they can overcome some of the barriers to intervening, because we know when we see a problem on a campus, it can sometimes feel like a big jump between seeing the problem and actually doing something about it. So one, we need to recognize that there are barriers, but then also provide strategies for doing so. And this webinar is really going to dive into what some of those barriers may be, and also how we can work around those or address those barriers. And the other takeaway, or the other thing to consider, especially as we're talking about some of the different ways institutions might approach this work, is that it may require colleges and universities to reframe their traditional approach to prevention. So under the Clery Act, not only do institutions need to have programs in place, their policy statements must have specific information, and that information is listed on the screen. So you'll want to think of kind of dual goals in terms of how we talk about prevention. So we have one, what are the prevention programs that we put in place on our campus? And then two, we have the question of how are we communicating or describing these programs within our annual security report. So in your annual security report, there has to be that policy statement. There has to be that statement that really describes the programming that you do in these areas. And within that statement, you have some of that specific information that you see on the screen. So the statement that the institution prohibits the crimes of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking as defined under the Clery Act. And that's something where certainly it's already something that is true for the campus. The campus already does not want these crimes to occur within their campus community. But maybe a question to ask yourself is, do we have that statement within our description around prevention programs? Definitions for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking in the applicable jurisdiction. So here's where we see some differences in terms of definitions. So in relation to prevention programs, that's where institutions are going to be talking about. We know that we have definitions that we use for Clery purposes, but what about in terms of our local jurisdiction? If somebody were to come forward and report, for example, to local law enforcement, what definitions are being used there, and how are we communicating about those differences on the campus? The definition of consent in reference to sexual activity in the applicable jurisdiction, a description of safe and positive options for bystander intervention, and we're going to be talking more about that, especially during this webinar, and then also information on risk reduction. An institution must also describe how it communicates about its procedures for response for sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, and also that prompt, fair, and impartial disciplinary process that it puts in place. But for the purposes of this webinar, again, we're going to focus this one specifically on that one element of primary prevention. So in order to implement these programs, before we move on to our discussion, it's also important to understand what's required under the law and the definitions of some of these terms. So the law does require both primary prevention and awareness programs. And even though the content may sometimes overlap within a specific program, the goal of each area is different, as you can see on the slide in front of you. So primary prevention is intended to stop violence before it occurs. So instead of looking at just how do we respond to a victim or risk reduction strategies, primary prevention looks at the attitudes and the behaviors that contribute to violence on campus. So it's working to change social norms and stereotypes that might perpetuate this type of violence within that community. Primary prevention also looks at the promotion of positive and healthy behaviors, and programs can include information such as healthy and respectful relationships and sexuality, and certainly safe bystander intervention, which we're going to talk about more in detail. So examples of positive and healthy behaviors might include things like good listening or communication skills. How do we build those respectful relationship skills, or how do we build some of these skills in terms of the relationships that we have on campus? Awareness programs are really meant to increase the knowledge of students and employees regarding sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So the awareness element really indicates to students and employees that the institution has a culture that's willing to talk about these crimes, and that they are willing to and are going to provide resources to survivors as well as the entire campus community. And then in addition to that, let's just take a brief look at how the law defines bystander intervention, since that's an area that we're going to be exploring during the webinar today, as well as we can kind of look and consider how risk reduction fits into the bigger picture. So bystander intervention includes those safe and positive options to prevent harm or intervene. So that includes recognizing situations of potential harm and understanding the institutional structures and cultural conditions that facilitate violence, overcoming those barriers to intervening, identifying safe and effective intervention options, and then taking action to intervene. So if we're thinking about institutional structures and cultural conditions that facilitate violence, that could include things like a fraternity or sports culture at some institutions that may not translate everywhere, but that could be the case at some campuses. Risk reduction is a phrase that's one of the areas where we may need to rework our thinking around what we think risk reduction looks like. Because under the Clery Act, it's defined as options designed to decrease perpetration and bystander interaction. So there's or inaction, excuse me. So there's kind of a clear link between how the Clery defines risk reduction and how bystander intervention is involved, and also increase empowerment for victims in order to promote safety and help individuals and communities address conditions that facilitate violence. So it's moving away from the idea of risk reduction that many folks think of, which is the kind of the idea of programs that talk about not walking alone at night or covering your drink when you're at a party, and really going more into looking at what might cause a bystander to not feel comfortable intervening, and then how do we address that on our campus. So let's start by unpacking the definition of primary prevention a little bit. And one element that we saw in that definition was the promotion of positive and healthy behaviors that foster healthy, mutually respectful relationships and sexuality. So this is where I'd love to get some feedback or some thoughts from all of you. So what I'd like you to do is, using the chat function to the right, share a few examples of how you address these healthy behaviors within your own campus program. So if you can just type in, when you think about your own programs, when you think about the work that you do on your campus, what are some of those behaviors that you're seeing, or ways that your programs address the positive side, the healthy behaviors that you're looking to see within a relationship or within your community. Okay, so we have a couple of people who are saying nothing yet, but they're going to be enrolling some. So this is something to recognize, and certainly that may be the case for many of you on the call. Some of you may have a number of different types of prevention in place. Some of you may be looking at, this is something that we need to build upon on our campus, and that's completely normal, and hopefully this will give you some ideas on where you might go. One person mentioned that they used the One Love workshop with students in the classroom. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that workshop, we actually did a webinar on it earlier this month, and that recording is available on YouTube as well, so that could be something that you could explore. Many people are saying they conduct workshops that have examples or role play. So in terms of a certain discussion or scenario, it gives them a chance to walk through and practice how to effectively have those conversations. TLC training programs, identifying characteristics of healthy relationships. So what does a healthy or positive relationship look like? Because there could be individuals, especially within the campus community, that have been exposed to only unhealthy relationships. So being able to explore what that might mean in practice, or some of those actions or behaviors that really make up a healthy relationship. We also have a number of different people saying that they really have conversations that are fused together. So they're looking at healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships at the same time, and kind of doing that, comparing and contrasting, and giving students and employees as well. I love that people are also talking about their employee programs, a better understanding as to what to look for in terms of the positive, but then also what to look for in terms of things that could be harmful or hurtful. So we have a number of different examples coming in, and what I love is many of the examples that are being shared by participants. One person talked about they just completed a health week on giving workshops on stress, drug abuse, healthy relationships. So many of you are talking about, well, here are many different departments that have programs related to healthy relationships in general. So it's not only just one individual or one department doing this work, but a couple of different places. And I also saw a couple of folks sharing about how they have faculty who have classes where some of these themes are also weaved in. So really great examples right at the start, so I appreciate that. So Tremaine, I'm going to go to you to start this conversation. From your lens, how do conversations about positive behaviors tie into prevention? Why is that an element of the work that we're doing?
Sure, thank you so much. So for us, it's really important to talk about positive behaviors on our campus here at VCU. Specifically, we're interested in showing students what we would like them to have in healthy relationships, and therefore then they will model those behaviors. And so we talk a lot about inclusion on my campus. We talk about gender roles. We talk about respect. We talk about privilege, because a lot of our students are coming with different values and different morals and different ideas about what those things mean. And so it's important for us to put them in a space where they can have conversations and have dialogue and have a uniform understanding of what those things look like, if you will, to one another within groups, across groups, and so forth. And so, for example, in October, one of our huge programs is the Red Flag campaign, and we have a lot of conversations about what red flags to dating and domestic violence actually look like. And then we talk about healthy relationships and talk to students about what they would like to see and like to have in a relationship to feel happy, sound, and whole.
That's really great, because one of the things I'm kind of hearing from what you're sharing is that it's really starting to look at what are the assumptions that we have going into these programs, and an assumption that I'm kind of hearing is that you don't assume that everyone comes from the same background or the same understanding as to what a healthy relationship should look like, for example, or what consent might look like. So really starting to think about, we first need to get kind of a base of where everyone is, and then use that to conduct conversations that are really appropriate to our audience. What about for you, Adrian? How do you see this concept or this idea of the positive behaviors tying into some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so a lot of times what we do is we talk a lot about dominant stories versus counter stories, and we talk a lot about how dominant stories really shape up what rape culture in rape culture is, and we try to push the students and staff and everybody in campus, in the different campuses that we work at, is to start identifying some of the healthy behaviors and the healthy ways they communicate with other people, and some of the people in their lives that did this with each other. And when we, for example, when we talk about masculinity, we sort of focus on that part and say, okay, well, this is the idea, for example, what a real man is, and this is the attributes that are given according to what society says, and usually those things tend to be something related to rape culture. But then we ask the second question and say, well, who's the strongest man in your life, and how is how did he shape your life in a sense? What are some of those positive things that happen? And once we start sort of focusing on those things, it kind of creates, for men and women, it creates the space for them to be able to talk about some of the healthy things and recognize some of the healthy aspects of the people that they have shared in their lives, and as they grow up and in their relationships. And what ends up happening, something that happens naturally, is that people sort of start to highlight those stories, to tell those stories about some of those positive relationships that they have in their lives. And the more they share those stories, instead of becoming the counter story, that becomes the dominant story, therefore becomes the norm. Because again, we're so bombarded by messages of what unhealthy relationships look like. Right, so it's sort of how to become aware of the healthy parts of relationships that we already share with each other. As Tremaine was talking about too as well.
Yeah, so it's almost putting it into context in terms of their lives as they're currently living it, but then also causing them to kind of rethink or reframe what some of the ideas they've kind of brought to the table in terms of what a healthy relationship or what's appropriate within an institution or within a college or university setting. So in terms of to kind of take us to more practical examples, we're talking broadly right now as to some of the things to consider, but what about in terms of the concrete, Tremaine, if we're looking at positive and healthy behaviors, what are some of the specific behaviors that this type of conversation would address?
Sure. I mean, for us here, with the particular groups that I work with and the male students that I work with and that I advise, it's important for us to pull apart gender roles and stereotypical and ascribed aspects of masculinity, which we broadly refer to as toxic masculinity, and really look at how that impacts males in terms of identity development, in terms of their everyday practical lives, how they interact with people. It's important to put folks together, male folks. We can talk about feelings, particularly, and have them talk about feelings around other males. For some people, they've never done that before. That's alien to them. And I also like to put them in spaces where they can collaborate with women, with females, with people from all genders, so that they can have an inclusive stance, as well as be comfortable working with folks from all different genders and learning from and with them. So, and that develops healthy relationships, in my opinion.
Right, and I think that kind of, I'm making the connection to something that Adrian said a little bit earlier, because Adrian, you were talking about, for many people, it might be brand new or they're not thinking about things in a certain way. You had mentioned, Tremaine, that men discussing their feelings might be something that they've never done before. And so, Adrian, when you had mentioned a little bit earlier about how the more often something happens, the more likely it is to become the norm, even these types of programs or these types of communities will then help kind of make that ability, make that option of talking about your feelings with other males more likely to be seen as acceptable, or more likely to be seen as something that that person is able to do within that space. So, Adrian, what are some of your ideas around how you can have these types of conversations? We heard some great examples from Tremaine. What might that look like?
Yeah, so we have something called campus conversations in different campuses, and it might look, it depends on the campus culture, it might look different, but it's just a way, organized ways to facilitate a conversation about masculinity. Now, we know for sure that men would always like to talk about masculinity. It's just hard to frame it, and hard to be able to get them into a room and get men and women into a room and have a conversation about healthy femininity, healthy masculinity, and this conversation sort of drive, and just ask the question, what does it mean to be masculine? What does that construct comes from? And allow the space to at least have the conversation, while at the same time having different people sharing different people in the room, or at least 3 or 4 people share a story about how did they grow up in a society where healthy masculinity was the norm. How did it affect them? What exactly did it mean for them to talk about gender and these things? And once that happens, something naturally happens where other people in the room starts having a conversation or want to share their story about masculinity and some of the things that were hard, some of the things that were good, some of the things that sometimes they're thinking about it all the time, yet they think that other people might not have the same idea that they have, or that they might not struggle. It's just hard to frame that conversation to make sure and facilitate that space. Once we facilitate that space, it kind of happens naturally. People want to meet again and continue having this kind of conversations.
Right, and Tremaine, you had mentioned, a lot of these similar conversations. Can you give us some examples of who does that work? You talked about having conversations around masculinity and men discussing the challenges of being males. How do these programs play out on your campus, or who's involved in facilitating those conversations?
Well, on my campus, I'm fortunate to work with a staff psychologist who's our men's issue specialist here in the University Counseling Center, and we work with a men's group in my office, which we broadly refer to as a male-identified group, so that folks from all genders can participate. And so we want to make it inclusive in that way. And so that's kind of the leadership of the group, but we pull males from all around the campus, and we have conversations with them broadly about everything that we're talking about in terms of toxic masculinity, healthy masculinity. We put them in spaces where they are able to challenge each other on their ideas and their belief systems and grow. And it's important for us to do that because, in my opinion, in terms of doing this work, it's about males challenging other males, not in the hopes that they're going to save females, but in hopes that they're going to challenge themselves and other males to be better.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for you on your campus, you mentioned having specific people that kind of have expertise in this area and are doing this work. But one thing, that I'll kind of expand or add to that is we've worked with a lot of different campuses who may not have individuals within that role, but they might have people that have knowledge or expertise or interest elsewhere on the campus. So whether that's looping in faculty members that may have some expertise in this area, it might be getting students trained that can help facilitate some of these conversations. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be someone in a dedicated role in order to be able to effectively have these conversations, but it certainly would want to be someone who's willing to invest the time to develop a program in a way that's effective and thoughtful, and that they're prepared for the kind of different questions and nuances that could come in as a part of that. And I think some of the other aspects of bystander intervention, which we're going to get to, is certainly also going to loop back and connect to that. So one of the things that comes up in terms of if talking around these issues, not just certainly around masculinity, but in general, how do we look at prevention of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, is bystander intervention. So those safe and positive options that can be carried out to prevent harm or intervene when there's a risk. That's the language that we see under Clery. So, Tremaine, just from your lens, because we know that this is a new piece to Clery, but there have been a lot of people doing this work even prior to when the law changed. So why do you think there's such a focus on this aspect on bystander intervention even prior to the legislation?
Sure, and I'll just touch really quickly on the previous point to add to what you were saying, and I would agree with you with regard to having folks assist with programming. Faculty across the campus are great, no matter what gender they are. It's important to have an interdisciplinary group of folks that assist. Community partners are awesome to work with. So we pull from wherever we can in terms of having folks help us develop our program, develop our middle students. With regard to bystander intervention, I think the important thing there is that we know the old paradigm that in terms of 20 years ago, 30 years ago, all females being portrayed as victims and all males being portrayed as perpetrators. We know that doesn't work. And with regard to ally movements, social justice movements, it's important to see bystander intervention as a community response, because the research shows us that if we can bring everyone together, have them learn skills, be active and empowered bystanders, because everybody's impacted differently, but everyone is impacted. And so it's important to teach those folks how they can, if you will, look out for other students, friends, what have you, on a community campus.
Right, absolutely. And I'm just going to ask for both of our presenters. We're getting a couple of feedback from participants, and I appreciate that. There was some feedback and some echo. So for our presenters who may have the audio on as well as their phone line, please just make sure that the audio is muted so we won't be getting the echoing. And thank you for that feedback. Anytime we have any technical challenges, we always like to know that so that we can be aware and address those as we go through. So Adrian, I think Tremaine gave us a lot to work off of right there. So can you share a little bit from your lens as to why you think this aspect is so, or this piece is so important? Okay, so it looks like we may be having some technical difficulties, so thanks for your patience with that as we loop back to get Adrian's audio back with us. But in terms of just to kind of reinforce some of what we were hearing, and one of the reasons why the Clery Center advocated for changes in the legislation is because we know that from what we're seeing around bystander intervention, that is what is causing an impact within campus communities in terms of changing attitudes and behaviors. The goal is to move beyond a community that just responds well if something occurs, but to a community that feels responsibility in terms of if something is happening, but also feels as though they have kind of the skills in order to be able to offer support or to be able to intervene if there is a problem. So one of the things that has come up quite a bit is that we know that there can be barriers to bystander intervention. So I want to ask those of you in the audience, as we're thinking about this, as you're kind of processing what this means or what this looks like on your campus, take a moment and use the chat function on the right and share some of the barriers that you think could stand in the way from someone intervening if there's a problem? And I'm going to take a moment to answer that, and I'm going to read some of the responses that come in. So already we're seeing backlash from friends and peer pressure as some options as to why someone may feel that they can't intervene. I'm seeing fear. A lot of other people are saying, I'm not really sure, or the person may not be sure that there is a problem or there is a concern. They might notice that they're feeling uncomfortable, but they're not necessarily sure the next steps to take. Not wanting to get involved or fear of retaliation if they do get involved. Some people are mentioning even indifference. So maybe that idea that this is not my problem, this isn't something that I should be needing to think about or consider. But most responses are really going back to that fear of, one, not knowing what the real problem is, or two, what's going to happen when I intervene. And then other people are sharing, well, they might just not know what to do. And probably all of us, even as professionals working in the field, have moments where we see something that's happening and we're driven to act, but we may not necessarily know, well, what's the actual action step that's going to be helpful in this situation? What do I do next? And that's coming from people who may have certainly been trained in bystander intervention. They might be doing this work on the campus, but even knowledge about what to do doesn't always make it easier in the moment. And so bystander intervention, as it's worked into programs, has to address that dynamic, because if we automatically assume that it's going to be easy to intervene, or if we act as though it just is a matter of somebody just doing it, we wouldn't have these challenges on the campus. People would already be saying and doing things to change the situations around them. So it looks like, as we've been working with our audio, I think that we had the chance to get Adrian back. So Adrian, are you back with us?
Yes, I believe so.
Wonderful. So before we kind of dive into some of those barriers, can you just share a little bit? I'm going to, just loop back for a moment. Can you think about or share why you think bystander intervention has been such an important part of the work that you do?
Sure. What I was sharing before was that bystander intervention is something that when we look at primary prevention, it's about stopping violence before it even starts. So what we try to focus on campuses is for them to understand that that students and also staff have to start recognizing other places where they already are bystanders with their family, with their friends, and something that already this is doable for them. But we also have to look at a culture of when we actually notice different things, when people say things that to other people and put them in a position where they're less than. And so, for example, if I'm in my group of friends, I happen to be a guy with a group of friends, and I notice some of my friends using the B word. Now, that might not be your typical, how do you call it, sexual assault, or the dominant story of sexual assault that says that, okay, the boogeyman is going to come and get you for somewhere, or this might be in a party. But if there is somebody referring about somebody else with the B word, that's a moment where you get to stand, and you get to say, hey, listen, this might not be to describe that particular person, because it's demeaning and it's putting somebody else less than. And there's 20,000 different ways in which this happens, and this goes from calling somebody the B word, from catcalling to even words such as you throw like a girl. All those things, sort of come together and become part of what we call rape culture, and allowed a sexual assault to happen later on, because all these things go unchecked through your day. And it doesn't have to be only sexism, but they're all the isms that a lot of times permeate in our society. That's what sort of makes rape culture, and those are the things that we have to constantly tackle before we even think about tackling the sexual assault. Those are the different parts of our relationships through our days as a campus community that we have to start tackling. Make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I also think it kind of feeds into some of the barriers that we were talking about, because one barrier might be that within my group or within the people around me, this behavior seems as though it's acceptable. So even being able to kind of overcome that barrier, we're going to talk about some examples of that, but even being able to address kind of that question or that concern of, is that really what's acceptable within our community, or is this how I'm interpreting? what my group or what my peers, or in the case of employees, what others on our campus are trying to do or believe. So, Tremaine, thinking about those barriers, what are some of the ones that you're seeing in the work that you're doing that you've had to think about as you've created a campaign, or that other campuses should think about when they're designing programs around bystander intervention?
Sure. One of the things that kept coming up for us this year, in the beginning of the year during our Welcome Week, we present to about 2,500 first-year students in a matter of 3 or 4 days, and we give them a presentation, and we were asking them about bystander intervention and what were the reasons why they couldn't intervene, and we were using this as a clicker question kind of survey, if you will. And fear, overwhelmingly, during every presentation, was the #1 reason why those students wouldn't intervene. So fear is a big one that we know of, and it could be fear of being hurt, it could be fear of not knowing what is really happening, or fear of being embarrassed if you intervene. So those are things that come up that I'm aware of. Power is one of them, and so within student organizations or sports teams or fraternities, you have people that sit at different levels, whether it be a team captain or a president or some sort of executive or governing body, and so there's power there that impacts. And it also could be an adult professional, whether it be an employee or a faculty member. So those are issues. Social isolation is a big one. So sometimes students receive retaliation where they're kind of made out to be pariahs, and they're not allowed to participate in friend groups or certain aspects of a community system if they are bystanders or report, if you will. And I think we also talked about social norms, and for some of them, some people don't know that things are problematic or bad, and so their social norming may be a little different than the broader community. And so those are aspects that generally come up in my experience.
I think that's a great point. And I think one of the reasons why it's important to have this conversation as to what are the barriers is that if we're designing programs but ignoring the barriers, that means in those opportunities where you do have a chance for students or employees to practice or be able to identify, we'll talk about some of those examples in just a moment. If we're not addressing the barriers, that means that the content that we develop or create is going to ignore that as part of those practices or those test runs. So if, for example, I feel comfortable intervening in a case study that I'm doing within a program, but that case study doesn't actually address any of the barriers that would prevent me from intervening, then chances are it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually take some of those skills that I'm learning within one space and putting them into practice within the real world. So that's where I want to kind of explore more deeply and maybe think about more critically. And one of the comments or questions that was coming up from a couple of you is, so say I'm at an institution and I have very little resources to do this. Say I don't have programming resources to funnel directly into this. What are some of the things that I can practically do regardless of the size of my institution or where I am in terms of implementing bystander intervention programs? So, Adrienne, can you share a little bit about, if I'm an institution and I want to have programs that encourage safe bystander intervention, what are some of the themes that I should be including? What are some of the things that I should think about, regardless of size? What should be on my radar in terms of putting this type of program in place?
Well, so one of the things that we a lot of times use is we incorporate stories of people intervening. So a lot of times, in order for for example, to have other men think that this is realistic, they have to see other men, and they have to see other men talking about how they were able to intervene and what they had to sort of go through in order to intervene. Sometimes they're powerful stories, sometimes they're negative stories, but sometimes they're stories that they can really relate to and say, oh, okay, I can see myself in this particular situation. The more they could see, they could hear the stories, and the more they're able the more they're able to say, okay, this is something that I might be able to do. At the same time, using the scenarios is so intricately important, and I think for any kind of primary prevention is so important because it gives you a time to practice what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, and sort of give you a little bit of muscle memory. And it's sort of, you get to practice different scenarios as they come, different stories as they come, and the, and the more that you're able to practice those scenarios, regardless of negative or positive, the more you can build you can build a little bit of rapport to be able to intervene in situations.
So Tremaine, I know that this is also something that you incorporate in terms of, building in scenarios or building into some of these practice elements. What kind of advantage do you see, or what has your experience been in using some of these stories?
I think the scenarios are awesome because, again, as Adrian mentioned, it gives folks a chance to practice. It helps them build muscle memory, and it eases some of the tension if you've never done it before, if you've never witnessed or seen a situation play out, and you've never practiced it before with another person or another group of people to hear how they think and see how they're going to respond. Then that makes it more daunting. And so I think that's important to do. To go back to that former question, I think having a focus group will be awesome because then you can pull from students and take what they're experiencing on their campus and use those as scenarios and use those as issues that you can address because every campus and every culture is different. I think collaborating broadly would be helpful to build relationships and build resources to get things done. Again, using community partners, popular culture, looking at national trends and issues, and pulling in practical examples of what bystanding looks like. And so one of the things that we talk about with students, which is quite funny, is as I talk to male and female students from all genders, and we talk about the mock club or house party or dancing situation where there is a guy that is creepy and he is trying to dance with a female, and a number of females that are friends with that particular person kind of swoop in and may make a circle around that person or kind of divert that person out of the way in a pretty savvy and non-intrusive, clever way, and the guy doesn't know what's happened. And we talk to students about, hey, that's a bystander intervention. You've seen this, you've done this before potentially, and you didn't even know it. And we also make connections with them to let them know that being a bystander or an active bystander is also the same as being an ally. There are very strong connections there between being an ally for someone and thinking about someone and understanding privilege and the dangers that someone else could be experiencing.
I think that's a great, kind of a takeaway from what you had just said is sometimes it's a matter of translating the terminology. And so that's what I love about the ideas that you both have been talking about of pulling from real stories within the community, because a lot of times, whether it's students or employees, they might not be making the connection that this one action item was actually bystander intervention. Because again, so many people have kind of been trained to think that it's only the large scale, it's only when something big is happening, it's only big, bold steps that are bystander intervention, and they overlook the example that you used was the females dancing in a circle around their friends. They overlook the little actions that are critical in terms of how we respond on our campus on a day-to-day basis. So, Tremaine, can you give some other practical examples? So when you're doing these types of case studies, when you're doing these types of role plays within your work, what are some of the practical examples that you use or you practice that this group might think about in terms of how they craft their own in relation to bystander intervention?
Sure. And so we like to talk to students about violent and nonviolent situations, and many of them often find themselves in nonviolent situations where they're being bystanders. And so it could be a situation where a person makes a derogatory comment about a group or about a person, and we talk to them about being bystanders in those situations. It could be a situation where a person has said something to someone else personally, whether it be derogatory or inflammatory, and we go through and talk to them about when and how you can be a bystander. What are your resources? So can you talk to that person in the moment? Can you talk to them later? Can you read up and learn more about a group of people or a situation to help educate your student team or your student organization? And so we give them a range of options to let them know that there's more than one way to be a bystander. And so, for example, one of the stereotypical ways that some males understand being a bystander is that they have to be physical and, you know, go in like He-Man and punch people in the face in terms of violent situations. And we try to get them, those folks that are stuck in the man box, if you will, we talk to them about how, you know, of course, that's, you know, that's not safety. That's a legal situation waiting to happen, and you could cause more harm than good. And so, again, it's important to give folks, you know, of all genders, a range of different options that they can use to keep themselves safe, to get out of a situation, and again, to make practical connections that being a bystander is not always a violent situation. It could just be you and a buddy at the library and something happens, and how are you going to respond in that moment?
And I think that's a great point, because one of the questions that's coming up from one of the participants was they were saying, well, what about if you're an institution that has gang-related issues where students are outnumbered by a large group of threats? How does a bystander deal with a similar situation? So I think it goes back to some of what Adrian and Tremaine were saying a little bit earlier, and are we pulling from real stories and real scenarios, recognizing that that would certainly be a threat to their health and safety and well-being, and letting them know that, you know, a strategy that they might use in one scenario might not be what they would put in place if certainly they could be at risk or their life would be in danger. So in terms of thinking about how we apply this at our own institutions, you know, we've heard some really great examples from both Tremaine and from Adrian as to application, but there are also other resources that you might utilize for this. So I just want to point you to two before we move on in our conversation. One is in the handouts section on your control panel. In addition to the slides that we're using for today, we also put in a handout related to prevention programs under the Clery Act. And what that does is it breaks down some of the definitions that you see within the Clery Act as to the requirements. And it also gives you an opportunity to practice, to go through and document, here's one program, here's how we would describe this program. And then in looking at these definitions and looking at the requirements, which elements of what's required are captured by existing programs. Because a lot of times what we see is institutions are starting to think, I need to reinvent the wheel, I need to start from scratch, when in reality they may have elements, you know, some of the things that we're talking about even on this webinar that are already in place. So it may not necessarily be of redesigning every program, but it might be a matter of sitting down and saying, okay, of the ones that do exist, what elements are we meeting? The other resource that I want to point you to, for those of you that are a part of the Know More, Do More campaign for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, is we have on the Know More page a link to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center's Bystander Intervention page. So when you're thinking about practical examples of how have other institutions applied bystander intervention, for example, on campus. Now, certainly that list is specific. Most of the resources are specific to campus sexual assault. Amy has also just plugged in that link within your control panel, so you can link from that directly from this webinar as well. But it gives you some concrete examples of, here are different bystander intervention programs that institutions have used. Many of those have the actual handouts or slides or curriculum on the pages themselves, so that you have an opportunity to dive more deeply into those and to see if some of those might fit some of the needs on your particular campus. So again, it certainly will go back to the size of your campus, the ability, you know, who on your campus is doing this work, but know that there are a lot of free resources and existing resources out there that can help you do that. And certainly there are other resources on that Do More page that are free and can be utilized as well. So going back to some of what we were talking about, we know that these conversations can take many different forms on campus. And so before we move into questions, we've had a couple come in already, I want to address the part of the law that calls for ongoing prevention and awareness campaigns. So that's a key piece to this type of education, that it's ongoing and it uses multiple strategies with different audiences. So can you describe, I'm going to start with Adrian, I'll move to this next slide here. Can you describe what a program or a campaign might look like based on some of the work that you're doing, Adrian?
Sure. So a little bit about where do you stand. It's a bystander campaign for college men, and basically we do a one-day training at whichever campus they call us, and within that one-day training, those 6 to 7 hours. It's a train the trainer. So what we do a lot of the time in campuses, what we do is we train student leaders, the chancellor, the office of the chancellor, staff all around, a diverse number of staff, all the way to campus police on this particular training, so that they actually later on can implement the training somewhere else within campus through the different communities. And what we try to do, is engage them in a sort of in a community organizing fashion. The more the more we can engage them to try to get them to have resources with different parts of the different campuses, the better for us. And what we do in this training, as part of the training, we have different posters that we ask the school to do a campaign for, and these posters could be. Depending on the school, usually you could use the standard posters that you see on the screen. However, sometimes some schools they say, well, we want to use some of our leaders in the school. So it could be a great teacher that is a great male teacher that could say I stand for my community when it comes to sexual assault. Where do you stand? It could be the face of a popular campus police person, a student leader, or a popular athlete that is actually doing this work. Those a lot of times seem to be more effective depending on the campus. And the idea is to create a culture where there are different people in the community that are taking a stand around sexual assault and primary prevention around rape culture. The more students and staff are able to see those pictures and those images, the more encourages a culture for students to be able to take a stand, and of course that is with also the training, and of course we have to remember there is also a journey. It's not sort of like this is something that you do one time and then we're gonna figure it out. Oh, it kind of worked. It's a process of how the campus reacts to these things. And what we've seen in the past is once we do a Where Do You Stand training and we put a campaign together, then all of a sudden different pockets of the university, all the way from student unions, all the way to the chancellor's office, all the way to campus police, all of them then all of a sudden start doing some of their primary prevention work around bystander intervention themselves within their communities and so on. And they start having a conversation on how they're doing some of this work.
That's excellent. And I think, a lot of the questions coming in are really talking about, how do we execute something like this on our campus? Certainly through Men Can Stop Rape is just one example, and we can plug in the information to their website as well so you can get a better sense of what that entails. We've also seen other examples of institutions building campaigns in-house. So one of the things that both Tremaine and Adrienne talked about is how do we have focus groups, or how do we have conversations with students, with employees on our campus to get a sense of what might be helpful within our community. So we've seen a number of different institutions also build campaigns in-house, really looking at some of the needs specific to their community. And on the website, I know that Men Can Stop Rape also has a number of different free resources in terms of one-pagers and kind of starter information in terms of information you might use for active or passive programming on your campus. So we are going to, as we mentioned on the Do More page, there's a number of different types of resources, not just from Men Can Stop Rape, but from many different organizations that campuses can use in terms of implementation or to start thinking about for their own application, but then also consider who are the resources on your campus. For Men Can Stop Rape, I know that they spend a lot of time in terms of assessment, making sure if we're going to put a campaign in place, we're going to have it be informed by the students or by students who would be utilizing the campaign and really make sure that it fits the need of the campus community. So think about if there are things that you are going to apply within your own community, have you spent that time to figure out, is this aligned with the culture on our particular campus? Is it something that is a good fit with the feedback and the information that we know about our students and our employees on the campus? So Tremaine, to expand upon that in terms of ongoing prevention and awareness campaigns, can you give some examples as to what that looks like for your particular campus?
Sure, and this is just one model that I'll touch upon briefly that I love using, and it's from Alan Berkowitz, who's one of the longtime folks who've done work around men's violence against women, who I love. And so empathy induction, for example, is one thing that we infuse into our program, and we want to help men understand that men are also victims and they can experience sexual assault and rape or other forms of violence. And so we find different movies or clips or stories or narratives to help them understand that. Obviously, talking about consent is pretty important. We've discussed the importance of bystander intervention. In terms of resocialization, that's about pulling folks together and having them really think critically about toxic masculinity, about the counter stories that Adrian mentioned, and how those stories are sometimes pushed to the bottom and aren't well known. And so putting males in a space where they can have more conversations about those stories and demonstrate to other males that you can be whoever you want to be. You can build your own man box, if you will, and do things outside of the stereotypical norm that lead to healthy masculinity. And so that gives other males permission to reorient themselves and develop their own man box, if you will. And the social norms piece, lots of males make decisions about how they should live their life based on this myth of manhood and toxic masculinity. And so for us, it's about, again, exposing what the reality is versus the myth. And so one of the things that Men Can Stop Rape does, for example, that I love is they talk about the real man, the strong man versus the real man. And so they talk about what it means to be a real man versus the strongest man they know. A similar exercise Michael Kimmel does, and he talks about real men versus good men. And the real man is the traditional stereotypical toxic masculinity man versus the good men that many of us know that are attentive, loving, and caring, and define their own man boxes. And so those things are important for us to do consistently throughout the year with the program that we work with.
And I think one of the kind of the general takeaways that we hope you all will consider, and thank you, because I think you shared some really great examples, is that the way that you execute this type of programming is really going to be specific to what is a good fit for your campus. So you'll notice that in my introduction, nowhere did I say the law is prescriptive and that you have to have this particular program on the campus. What it does is it gives you a structure for the type of programming. So yes, there needs to be bystander intervention, but what does that mean in terms of your particular campus and practical examples that you might utilize in your programming or in how you execute a campaign? One person, and thank you for your feedback, one person was saying, well, we have a small school, we only have 3 programs with a student body of 300, plus the average age is 33 years old. They come to campus, they leave with little social interaction with classmates. Is this going to be appropriate for our population? And I think that that's going to be certainly a question to think about or to consider. So, for example, we just had interaction with someone on a campus who was sharing with us. They were with a smaller community college, and they had really been working on building their programs around a number of these different topics. And they said, we thought that within our campus community that there really wasn't a problem with many of these crimes. And when we started doing more intentional programming around, in their case, it was domestic violence in particular, they found that there were a number of students that were coming forward and looking for support, looking for resources, looking for information that they had never connected with before, because it was something that was impacting a broad range of their students, but they had never before had a structure for having these types of conversation or having these types of programming. So recognizing that these crimes unfortunately do address a wide range of populations, but the critical thing to take away is that you are likely to know your campus culture better than anybody else. And if you don't, then there may be steps you can take in terms of focus groups or in ways that you might do a climate survey, for example, to better understand how this might fit the needs of your particular institutions. Now, with that in mind, I want to go to some of the questions that were coming in as we were going through, many of which you were answering as we went throughout the webinar. But one question that I wanted to pose to, I'll start with Adrian and then Tremaine, if you have anything to add, is someone was asking about best practices with international students and cultural differences and barriers. So in your work, have you seen any best practices in terms of how you can address a number of different cultural differences or different types of barriers that may come up?
Yes. I think a lot of our best practices come from the work that we do with our youth, and the work that we've doing with our youth in middle schools and high schools all through the United States and sometimes internationally. One of the things is about making no assumptions, and it's extremely important, and meeting men where they're at. And what that means, in a sense, is uh, unhealthy masculinity. Nationally and internationally, we live in a society where our patriarchy and sexism are sort of the norm, and this allows for the idea of less than, the perspective that less than is at the core of how a lot of times we function in society, regardless if it's a Western society or it's any other society. And me growing up in different countries. So the issue at hand is how to be able to engage men in a conversation where they really can notice those aspects of unhealthy masculinity within their cultures and within their sense of being. In some cultures, it might be normalized, but just because it's normalized doesn't mean that is healthy in a sense. Just like in this culture, many of these aspects are still very normalized and they're seen as okay. But we get to challenge those things. But it's how to get in a conversation where we actually meeting people where they're at, where the conversation we're not judging, we're not coming with a sense I know better than you because I am from this particular organization or because I have this perspective, but much more about as Tremaine is saying, who's the real man between this particular person and this particular person? Why? What are the attributes? What makes them a real man? What are the conversations that need to have in order for us to get to a consensus? And then you start unpacking those things around unhealthy masculinity with all those things. So again, meeting where they're at and making no assumptions are two aspects that come to mind as we work with the young people that we work with.
And I think Tremaine, that goes back to kind of where we all started in terms of this webinar, because one of the first things that you talked about, which I thought was so critical, is really looking at, walking into the room and making sure that you have a sense of what our audience is or who we're trying to communicate with. So in terms of some of the best practices, I think what I've seen at a number of different campuses is really working to understand, so who are the populations that make up our particular campus, and how do we design programs that can be adapted or that can do exactly what Adrian was just saying and meeting them where they're at. And since that was the kind of final question that we received from participants, many of which the other ones you've addressed as we've gone through, Tremaine, would you have anything to add in terms of your experience and best practices in working with international students?
Sure, and so I agree with Adrian's sentiment. I would also say being interdisciplinary is important, and so pulling from faculty members on your campus that may do research in sociology or women and gender studies, different academic disciplines where they can give you some insight into literature, theory, and things that you can use to address multicultural men within the country and internationally. I would say Men Engage is a network, a organization out of Washington, D.C. that does work internationally with males, and so they're pretty awesome. Looking at other things or other scholars like Michael Flood or Connell, and those are folks that talk about masculinity and men's issues, internationally, and Connell talks about masculinities in particular, and looking at the diversity within men and masculinity and how there's a pecking order with regard to males based on what you look like or how tall you are, how much money you have, or what part of the country or what country you actually come from. So there's a different pecking order with regard to social identity, and so that's very important. So those are some of the things that we think about. And again, I think it's important to sit down and talk with people and figure out what are some of the concerns they have, what are the issues, what are the things that are culturally relevant for them, and building that into your program. Because if the program is a one-size-fits-all model and it's not culturally relevant and inclusive and dynamic, then you're going to bore people and not engage everyone. And it's very difficult to do, but that's the only way to sustain a program that it's going to meet the needs of a diversity of different males and different male-identified folks.
And I think that's one of the reasons why the law itself is not prescriptive, because every campus is so different. And another kind of important thing to consider or to look at is that even though there are requirements under Clery, it doesn't mean that you're going to have one program that's going to address all those different requirements. So for those of you who are sitting here kind of heads reeling thinking, well, where am I going to go next with this information? I'd encourage you to use the checklist that we attached as the handout for this webinar to really kind of bring yourself back to that place of, well, where do I start? And so again, the way that you use that handout or that checklist is to go through, start with a description of a program that you're doing, and just start looking at some of those specific definitions. Which of these definitions on the front page is this particular program addressing? So you might find that you have one program that's addressing bystander intervention, you have another program that's addressing aspects of risk reduction and barriers. So there might be different pieces of the requirement that are being met, but in multiple different places on the campus. So start from where you are and build from there. And certainly, as I mentioned, that No More page for National Campus Safety Awareness Month has a list of a number of different free resources that you can utilize to implement these programs. Also reach out to some of the national organizations like National Sexual Violence Resource Center, Stalking Resource Center, a number of the other resources that are listed on the Know More and Do More pages, so that you can start from partnering with others and then building upon that. You also likely have local county victim service organizations or state victim service organizations that can help contribute to that. So I want to say thank you again to Adrian and Tremaine and to all of you for joining us today. In your chat panel, you'll see the link to the evaluation for today's webinar. We'd really appreciate it if you take a few short minutes to share your thoughts and your feedback. We'd love to know what kind of content you'd like to see more of as we plan additional webinars for the rest of 2015. And this webinar was just one of several webinars for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So the recording will be available on the Know More page for NACSAM, and it will also be loaded on the Clery Center's YouTube page. We also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the Clery Center handle for daily campus safety information, and we're using that hashtag of NACSAM 2015. You can also visit our website to learn more about other training opportunities and learning resources, such as our Clery Center Collaborative Program, which is our team-based learning membership program that brings together colleges and universities to build sustainable approaches to campus safety and Clery Act compliance. We've seen a number of different collaborative members do really incredible things in terms of building not just their prevention programs, but also their other responses on campus. And so throughout the month of September, which we know is almost over, NACSAM participants receive 10% off of collaborative registration for the first year of membership. So if any of you in that, or that's something that you've been considering, now's a good time to reach out to us. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us using the email you see on the screen, info@clerycenter.org. So thank you again for joining all of us today and for all of our webinars for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and we hope you have a great afternoon.